everyone, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by the National Conference of State Legislatures. My name is Gene Rose, formerly of NCSL, and now with the strategic communications firm of Marmillion & Company. This is the 8th webinar that is part of the NCSL University series. We hope that you'll join us as we explore other issues and provide professional development opportunities throughout the year. Previous sessions on social media trends, social media policy issues, child abuse reporting laws, an April report on the fiscal health of states, the 225th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution, and one on media relations are all archived and available on the NCSL website. Those sessions are free for state legislators and legislative staff to access at any time. Our format today is that our speaker will present his information for about the next 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor to your questions. And as Kara stated previously, you can submit a question at any time during the presentation in the chat box located in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, but we will wait until after the presentation before we start answering those questions. The subject for our webinar today is the Mississippi River, stretching across 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces. The Mississippi River runs through our nation's cultural heritage and remains vital to American prosperity. But the big river faces challenges that affect the entire nation's future. Our speaker today is heading an effort that will bring together key stakeholders for an analysis of the river that will detail the consequences of inaction and outline opportunities for cooperation that will lead to a more sustainable system. Val Marmillion is the managing director of America's Wetland Foundation and leads an effort to address the devastating loss of Louisiana's coastal wetlands and the resulting economic and environmental impacts on the rest of the nation. As founder and CEO of Marmillion & Company, he is recognized as one of the top campaign strategists in the country, the 2-time winner of the Public Relations Society of America's prestigious Silver Anvil Awards and other national honors, leads a firm that specializes in environment, energy, art, education, healthcare, government, political and grassroots public education, and outreach. He served on the staffs of 2 U.S. senators and 2 members of the U.S. House, including being the Chief of Staff for then Congressman John B. Breaux. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Val Marmillion. Val?
Thank you, Gene, and Kara, thank you, and thank NCSL for their sponsorship of what probably we'll look back on as some of the groundbreaking webinar series with the technology that's available to bring people together without the high cost of travel and loss of time, downtime at work. We're going to talk today, as Gene said, about the Mississippi River. And first, let me say that to get to the river, you have to go through many routes. It's sort of like the river and its tributaries itself to actually get to the big issues that are facing the river, and there are some very large issues of sustainability facing America's most important natural resource. We're going to go through a discussion about how the various aspects of the river, particularly its delta, have to be understood before we can get into the middle of some of the more perplexing issues that face us about the Mississippi River system. So today, I would like to take you down the river in a tour, in a journey, and tell you a little bit about the foundation that we work with, America's Wetland Foundation, that was established in 2002. This was created in Louisiana to begin with because there was a great loss of land that was going to have huge economic and environmental impacts on the rest of the nation. And certainly today, just a few days after Hurricane Isaac has made its way from the Gulf of Mexico up literally through a river course following the water, we have evidence not only of what's happening environmentally to our delta and those areas that are experiencing drought in our country, but we have sort of a display almost of some of the major problems facing delta regions around the world. In the United States, we call it a trifecta. We have the combination of a Mississippi River where the sediments have been trapped by levees or dammed by locks or other devices that have kept the sediments down in from flowing into the delta, which has made it very vulnerable to coastal erosion. Then we have natural subsidence in the delta areas where the land actually sinks. And if we had a delta that was receiving its nutrients and sediments from the river without those being trapped, that subsidence would naturally be taken care of, and you would have a continual building of land to deal with or to replace the land loss from subsidence. But the third part of the trifecta is global warming and sea level rise. Sea level rise in the Gulf of Mexico is one of the higher rates among deltas of the world. So with these three real challenges facing us, the state of Louisiana 10 years ago said we had best alert the nation and the world to what's going on, because there's not generally awareness of what's happening down here having an impact on what's going on up there, meaning in the river region in the 31 states of the Mississippi watershed. The foundation, since its beginning, has served sort of as a neutral arbiter, bringing together many diverse interests, because one of the things we realize is that time is not on our side, and we have to really move quickly to restore the coast. But similarly, we have to move quickly to deal with some of the sustainability issues of the Mississippi River itself. And we'll go more into that, but I previously mentioned the drought that has been caused. Well, the drought that we're experiencing, that has caused huge dislocation economically and environmentally within the river system. In the middle and upper parts of the river, it's greatly exacerbated the flow of commerce because of low water in the river. And down at the south, when we have storm events, the saltwater intrusion that moves into a very low flowing river can cause great damage to the ecosystems and really turn the flow of the river back upriver if the velocity of the storm is strong enough, similar to what we just saw with Isaac. We've also been working at the America's Wetland Foundation on Gulf Coast critical environmental and economic benefits that the nation could enjoy and the 31 states of the Mississippi River could enjoy if we take care of our ecology and our ecological challenges. One of the activities that we spend a lot of time working on is to try to let people really grasp the relationship of a strong environment to a strong economy. Most people in the past, let's say 20 years, have tried to create silos of the environment or the economy, and you're either in one silo or another. But in fact, the notion of ecosystems, ecology, and economies are all very inextricably tied. And the sooner we get to understanding that you have to have a strong environment, have a strong economy, the better off the river system is going to be. We also are very much about a balanced dialogue. We realize that the way this nation works, it's not all politics, it's not all industry, it's not all NGOs, it's not all local government, it's not all state government. All of these play a significant role in the ways in which a system functions, whether it be a political system, a social system, an economic system, or an environmental system. And so the foundation has gone to great lengths to make sure that whenever we convene activities or forums, all interests are at the table. In fact, when the foundation was launched, the president of Environmental Defense Fund and the president of Shell Oil Company were standing side by side of the governor and state legislators in announcing this foundation, saying that we had to have a new way of looking at issues because we had hit the wall with conflicts and acrimony in dealing with some of the primary issues that are facing our country. And the big issues are sort of being put to the side because they're so difficult to deal with. So through executive briefings and public events and convening activities and leadership forums, issuing reports and polls, creating research and studies around some of the region's biggest challenges, the foundation has been able to influence the way education on these issues is developed and modernize our understanding of what the problems facing the region are and how to define them beyond the old definitions that were more mechanical and more from an industrial point of view, and more into this view of a whole ecology world that includes the economy as well as the environment. We have been very, very quick to respond to crisis, and quite frankly, we have had enough crisis to deal with when you consider Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Wilma in Florida and Louisiana region somewhat, and the BP oil spill and the latest storm Isaac. These events have cost the American taxpayer well over $150 billion. And the question that the foundation continually raises is, why is this country so quick to respond to disaster, but so slow to plan in a way that can avoid disaster and huge financial costs to the taxpayer? And these are some of the issues that we are building around talking about getting ahead of river sustainability as soon as we can. Again, the foundation is positioned more broadly than when it was started, because it created a group called America's Energy Coast, which are the 4 producing states, but also dipping into Florida for some of the economic modeling that goes on with tourism and the fishing and shrimping fleets that are found in those in that state. So the 5 Gulf states work together now within the America's Energy Coast project. Over 100 major businesses and industries, national environmental conservation organizations, universities, landowners, community leaders, and legislators have joined on and created also a network of over 150 federal elected and administrative officials who work and receive educational information from the foundation and our studies, as well as policy recommendations. So on this page, you see there's an industry council. There are the leadership council I mentioned of elected officials. There are different task forces that we've created to deal with emerging issues, everything from climate change and sea level rise to the resiliency issues that face residents of coastal communities today, because their regions have become much more vulnerable and to the rising tide. We utilize volunteer relationships for expertise and research leaders with some of the top universities and engineering and research organizations in the country. And our elected and administrative officials work in a nonpartisan way to provide full participation and information back to their legislative bodies. So to get to the river, I was mentioning there were the need for several strategies. And one of our strategies was to assess what was actually going on at the end of the river and to understand better what was happening along the various communities in something we called America's Energy Coast, those 5 states, and to begin learning what the resiliency issues were and what these communities along the Gulf Coast would have to do to adapt to change. We went, as the map shows, across the Gulf Coast from Texas to Florida, and we dealt with a lot of major issues and also tied in the President's task force on Gulf Coast ecosystem restoration, where you see a picture of John Hankinson, who's the presidential appointee to handle that task force, in bringing them in to better understand how the regional voice needs an ear from the federal government so that this region will not continue to erode and move into a state of disrepair that we will likely not be able to afford to fix in the near future. So a lot of our materials have been developed in conjunction with the states in the administrations and the legislatures, with counties and parishes along the Gulf Coast, and then along with the federal agencies so that they understand the source of the information and the recommendations. We convened 11 forums in about as many months, identifying specific vulnerabilities of communities and bringing unique expertise to each forum that we could understand sort of a microcosm of what was happening in what we would call the broader Gulf region, but then the individual separate ecosystems within the region of the Gulf. We were very interested in honoring the core values of the region, in giving a voice and building local pride, because in many ways this has been such a hard-hit area that there was a sense that the voice of the region was not always heard. And we thought that by going to the grassroots with a program and finding out what was on people's minds and listening, we could empower people to become more involved in the legislative and democratic process. And certainly that is what happened as a result of our many forums. You can see here that we did research, we convened people in working sessions. We called them the leadership forums, which were built like a large UN roundtable where all interests were at the table. And then after the forums would conclude, we would go into the local papers and try to find feedback from the public based on the issues that were discussed in a region. We had some help, and these are too difficult slides to look at, but the first, we had some help from a company called Entergy, which is the power company, which is, I think, been having a real difficult time the last week in making sure that the power got turned back on to everyone. But I think they had lost over 900,000 individual points of power for customers during the last hurricane. They helped us by sponsoring a study of what the infrastructure of the Mississippi Delta, what infrastructure was vulnerable to this trifecta, these three approaches that I mentioned. And then once they helped us identify that by zip code, we were able then to talk with the communities about how do you become resilient based on knowing that you have these vulnerabilities. So the first little thumbnail sketch there is just a map of the storm routes over time and their intensities in the Gulf Coast area that we were talking about. And as you can see, there have been so many storms, it's hard to determine the line where the coast begins because there's been so many storms in this region over time that have caused huge cost concerns to individual states and to the federal government itself. And then the second slide of the states were the zip codes and the different areas where the study from Entergy and the America's Wetland Foundation took into account how vulnerable these particular areas. The darker the little dots, the more vulnerable the area in these slides. In this study, we looked at several hazards along the delta of the Mississippi: wind-related damage, sea level rise, and storm surge. And the conclusion of the study, unfortunately, was that with sea level rise and climate change, the intensity of storms and the level of damage over the next several years, 30 to 2030, was going to dramatically increase. That certainly the climate variations that we're going to see are going to lead to more intense and long-lasting storms, as is evidenced by Hurricane Isaac. And so you have a high and a low in the study and a mean average of what the increase in cost to protecting the region will be. And the sad part of the story is that the costs for repairing the infrastructure in the Gulf Coast will not equal its economic growth during the next 30 years if we don't do something to better sustain the coast and provide for coastal restoration. That means repairing the wetlands that are being lost and also providing security for the barrier islands in these areas that provide a buffer against storm surges that ultimately impact all of the economies of the Mississippi region. If you look at this map that I'm showing you, it's a chart and a graphic. We call it the spider web, but these are the 11 different forums that we conducted, and it shows you how we had the discussion about resiliency. We asked, previous to every meeting convening, our research indicated where the community felt it was on the resiliency index. If they would have been completely resilient in their assessment, the entire circle would have been completely blue. But it's not, and these different lines show you how bad some communities rated themselves, badly communities rated themselves on the resiliency scale, and where others are doing well. So you see, for example, under risk knowledge, everyone is almost below at a 2 level or below, except for one community. Under warnings and evacuation and disaster response, most are above a 4. And so you can see the pattern of what has happened over time, recent time in the Gulf Coast, where people have more knowledge about the dangerous and disaster circumstances, but their risk knowledge is not too great. Their dealing with coastal restoration and protection is not too great. Their land use and structural design issues are still not rating in a high resiliency score. And even on governance, most of the ratings come in at around 2.5. So there's a long way to go for the region in becoming resilient. And this scale was developed by a National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration project after the tsunamis in the China Sea, where a resiliency index was put to show what was likely to happen to these communities again if such an incident occurred. And then we modeled our program from that study so that we could gain a better knowledge, individual community, of their resiliency and create this resiliency index. So what did we learn from this program? We learned that, number one, the federal government has to urgently act in this region to protect the goose that laid the golden egg, if you will. If we lose the Mississippi Delta and the Mississippi River resources, the 31 states and the economy of the nation will be so dramatically affected that prices will rise for all goods and services, including agriculture and commodities. All the world's largest port system is in this region, and the feeder systems to the Mississippi, namely the Intracoastal Waterway being one, the Red River another, these feeder systems in the lower Mississippi River are in great disrepair, and open water conditions because of coastal land loss on the Intercoastal Canal is becoming a very serious problem for low-profile vessels such as barges to move east and west to get the goods and commodities and oil and gas and chemicals into the Mississippi River feeder system. And so the federal government acting urgently would be very important. And what do we need them to do? Some of this isn't going to be a surprise to you on this webinar, but there are conflicting rules at the federal level. There are policies that the federal agencies disagree with one another, so when you're beginning to work on getting permits, you have to go through sometimes a 15 to 30-year process because of the disagreements among the federal agencies. And a more orderly, efficient process must be established to meet the urgent needs. And one of the things that's really critically needed is sort of an emergency rule that would allow for those areas that are under complete urgent situations to gain access to permits in a quicker way so that the land can be repaired and the navigable waterways can be repaired. The second issue that affects the entire Mississippi River is we need to deploy in the area multiple lines of offense. Sometimes you've heard this talked about multiple lines of defense, but we like to look at it as getting rid of the piecemeal fixes and having an integrated systems approach to solving the coastal degradation problem along the Mississippi Delta. The focus must really shift to a long-term vision of how the integrated parts of the Delta, the Middle River, and the Upper Mississippi River all come together and see themselves as one system that has an integrated plan for sustainability. So you don't begin to focus on congressional districts or senatorial districts or towns and cities only that can have muscle to get federal appropriation, that you really work together and have priorities within the system so that the entire ecological system of the Mississippi River is joined together and protected. The innovation and enterprise must be allowed to flourish. And maybe not surprising to many on this call, but in Louisiana and some parts of Texas and Mississippi, there is now sort of a restoration economy that's been created because there's been so many storms and weather events. But this economy cannot be the only innovation that's allowed to flourish. We think that we have to look at new technologies for power, new ways to shore up the coastline. There have to be ways to use carbon that is emitted in this area because of the petrochemical plants and refineries. But there has to be a beneficial use of carbon that can help to build wetlands, sequester carbon, but also have maybe a market, secondary market for carbon that will take the greenhouse gas emissions out of the air. All of this helps those industries that are up and down the river and certainly the populations of the river basin. And then we need to revitalize the regional strengths and pride, empower communities to self-determination. We have to actually realize that the federal government is not going to come in and solve all the problems. And so some communities along the Gulf Coast are now taxing themselves, supporting ways and funding mechanisms, whether it be through tourism or other mechanisms, so that they can build monies to do restoration and protection activities. The cultures are being decimated, as this land and Barrier Island communities are lost. And there have to be ways to either relocate whole communities or begin to sound the alarm that we need to figure out a foundational response to protecting the cultures that were indigenous to this area because they're being lost. And this is going to take a lot of local energy to get this done. And finally, we need to sustain action based on these recommendations. So next Wednesday, we are going to Washington with a much deeper version of this report and these findings to go into D.C. on Capitol Hill, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, meeting with lobbyists from industry and NGOs to talk to them about specific recommendations from these series of 11 meetings that will impact the future of the Mississippi Basin. I mentioned that we are part of a larger system, and you can be part of the larger Mississippi Valley system that you see on the left side in the United States. And the orange dot means that it is a high and dangerous situation that is faced by this area. And the Mekong region we juxtapose on the other side in the east is an extreme situation, loss of land, loss of agricultural products. And we're trying to work at the world level with these river systems so that their nations and the nations who utilize the system can better understand the value of protecting the system and the value from national security, from agricultural and commodities interests, and from energy. And then we layer onto that the extreme environmental consequences that will occur and loss of species and loss of habitat if these systems are allowed to degrade much more. So we try to have this conversation at an international level. We'll actually have a second World Delta Dialogues in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, in May of 2013 to follow up on a conference, similar conference we had in the Mississippi River Delta in 2010 in New Orleans. So all of these programs lead us into a timeline of trying to move into programs with the America's Wetland Foundation that help us restore the river. And with our Big River Works project, we are connecting ideas and interests in 5 forums up and down the river. And we started this program in New Orleans with the goal of increasing public awareness of the river's national importance. And I know that most of you would think that this is obvious, but there is not a real focus on the Mississippi River system by our nation. In fact, in the last EPA appropriation, the Mississippi River as a system was not called out for any appropriations at all, whereas the Great Lakes and the Chesapeake and Calfed and other systems that are recognized by the federal government received hundreds of millions of dollars for their sustainability. So this is a very critical point, is connecting the public and policymakers to its river, providing, again, a balanced forum so that diverse stakeholders can attend and raise ideas, and hopefully begin to move away from a litigious answer to what ails the river into one that is more cooperative and fast-moving. We need to reconnect the Delta with the upriver interest so that we understand we're all in this game together. And truly, we are, but I don't think people in the mid and upper river think of themselves as being connected to the Delta, and I don't think people in the Delta think of themselves being connected to the mid and upper river, and they're inextricably tied. We need to really understand the major threats to this watershed. We are seeing the beginnings of water wars in our country, and this is not a good omen. But in Georgia, there are some they call them the water wars with Alabama. We're seeing some Red River issues with the need for taking of water for agriculture and freshwater needs, and we're going to see it up and down the Mississippi River. And those conversations need to be had now before the problems become more acute. And so we need to identify key opportunities for states to cooperate. We need to find a way to build a compact among states, because as these statistics point out, the 3rd largest delta in the world, the 4th largest watershed in the world, the billions in agriculture, the millions of tons of cargo, and jobs that are connected. Most all jobs within the basin, in some way or another, have a relationship to that Mississippi River for either the economic prowess of our individual communities, or the ability for us to transport and move goods and services. It's a tourism mecca that is not often described as a unified tourism mecca. And as a bird habitat alone, it is 60% of North America's bird population using this river region as its migratory flyway. And 25% of all North American fish species live in the watershed. 60% of all of our grain exports, as mentioned in the bullet above. This is an enormous resource, and it's not one that we would like to play around with much longer. And so we're creating the Big River Works program. As I said, we started in New Orleans. We'll be in Memphis, Tennessee, to talk about the Big River Thrives, and this is sort of focusing on the ecosystem and the habitats it supports. The Big River Lives will be in St. Louis, Missouri, talking about water quality and water quantity and how we can deal with a more toxic river and the need, as the President has discussed, for a more robust agricultural output. How do both of these happen in tandem? and how do we cooperate for a better outcome of both. The Big River provides in Minneapolis-St. Paul. We'll talk about jobs, communities, culture, and tourism. And then we'll end in Chicago with a program that focuses on the Big River move and how this river really moves the economy of the nation, but what trapping and damming and locks of the river have meant to its ability to move and to serve the population and the economy and the ecology as best it can. At that Chicago meeting, we will also have a one-day focus on building the framework for a cooperative agreement or a compact among states so that we can truly recognize and realize a Mississippi River system that is more unified. The governor, the Honorable Pat Quinn, the Illinois governor, former lieutenant governor there, and the lieutenant governor of Louisiana are steering committee co-chairs, and we would like to have as many state legislators join the steering committee as possible. And you can see just by the slide, and you may want to go study it later. I'm not going to go through it completely, but there's a high-level group of interested civic soldiers as well as elected officials who are already starting to come on to the steering committee as this is our first phase of the river program with these 5 programs, 5 leadership forums. So you can become a member of the leadership committee, serve on the steering committee, the Honorary Leadership Council for America's Energy Coast. We have, I know, close to 50 or 60 state legislators already. We welcome more. And you can attend the meetings. Certainly, the January 17th meeting in Minneapolis is being designed to talk about communities and states, and legislators and mayors are going to be a large part of those attending that event. And if you know of issues that you want to talk about more, please contribute testimony and lead us to research so that we can make it part of the official record. And of course, more information will continually be uploaded, including the links for this webinar on bigriverworks.org. Gene, I'll turn it back over to you at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Val, for that comprehensive look at the project and the importance of the Mississippi River. And it is now time to take your questions. Again, as a reminder, you can submit your questions in the chat box at the lower right hand corner of your screen. We've got a couple in already that we'll get Val to respond to right now. Val, there's been some publicity recently that the dead zone around the Gulf is at the lowest level it's been in a number of years. Does this mean things are improving?
Well, that's a good news story. The reason that it's low is because of the drought, and that it's smaller. The dead zone at one point was in some high tide seasons when we have great water flow in the Mississippi. It had become as large as the state of New Jersey out in the Gulf, and it was reaching into Texas outside of Louisiana and Mississippi. And so the dead zone is a real deal. It is built up from the excessive concentrations of nutrients that are trapped by the levees and sent into the deep Gulf outer continental shelf. But when you have high water events on the river, the hypoxia zone will grow. But during this drought season, it has lessened. So this is not necessarily good news. It is the consequence of a drought, which, of course, is also bad news.
Okay, well, our next question kind of ties in with that. The questioner said it seems the river has been the focus of a couple of major events this year. First, the drought that brought traffic to a standstill in some places, and then Hurricane Isaac, which has kind of followed up the river. It seems like a lot of what affects the river is out of our hands. Is there really that much that policymakers can do that can improve the health of the river?
Well, I guess the sad answer to this question is that we have done a lot to manage the river, and now we're dealing with the unintended consequences of man's intent to manage the river for a short period of time, and the consequences continuing over a long period of time in what we are now experiencing. Let me give you a couple of examples. We just talked about the hypoxia zone being the result of sediments being trapped and nutrients from mostly farmlands and urban runoff going into the system, the Mississippi River, and landing at the Gulf, causing a dead zone. And that's a zone that's depleted of oxygen and certainly affects fish and marine species and habitats. But the bigger unintended consequence that we're seeing with trapping of sediments and the levees are that the delta of the system that protects the water navigation assets of the river and the habitat and the flyway, all of these things that you can layer on top of each other, are caused by actions of man, and they need to be adjusted. The decisions were made, flood protection and navigation interest, to levee the Mississippi River and to dredge the Mississippi River. But in that decision, there was knowledge that what the consequence would be a dying wetland, and that later generations would have to realize this and adjust the plan, adjust the actions to make that undo that consequence. And so what we've ended up with is a broken system based on people who made decisions for not the lifetime of the Mississippi River, but the short term of the Mississippi River, but are now extending into long-term consequences. This has to be taken care of, and this is part of what we hope to discover with the Big River Works program as we go to these different cities.
Okay. And that kind of ties into our next question. It's the last one we have in queue. And again, remind everyone, if you do have a question for Val, please go ahead and write that in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. It says, your goal to have an accord among the river states seems ambitious. How are you going to work to get the states to become part of an accord?
Well, in the presentation, I mentioned the fact that we don't have an accord. We're losing out on hundreds of millions of dollars that are being apportioned to other systems, other ecosystems, whether it be the Chesapeake or the Great Lakes or CalFed or others. That, to me, is incentive enough to begin thinking differently about what we have in terms of a system that needs to be sustained. We don't have monies in these individual states to do what it will take to repair this system in a way that it's automatically sustainable. And so, first of all, we need to determine what that means. And we have to begin to remove the divisions, whether they be state lines or whether they be special interest. And I include as special interest all the interest of the river. And I don't say that in a pejorative way at all. But there are navigation and transportation interest. There are economic interest. There are freshwater supply interest. There are agricultural interest. There are flyway and habitat interest. There are the general life-serving interest of the major artery in the United States that provides sustenance and life to every finger and tributary that it touches. So these are enormous issues that cannot be left in a small forum to decide. And it's incumbent upon the states to start getting together, because there's not a federal Mississippi River authority to take care of the problem.
Okay, and we've got a kind of a follow-up question on this, Val. It says we typically see more legislation in the upper basin states as the main stem of the river to protect the wetlands and floodplains than we do in the lower basin. First, I guess if you'd agree with that assessment, and how would you suggest we engage lower basin state legislators more effectively?
I think that the states on the upper Mississippi have been more attuned to the impact that the river provides their states, whether it's economic or ecological. I don't think that many people in the lower river understand the river as a river. In 1927, the levying of the Mississippi River occurred. The people, it's been explained to me that from that point, people visibly and physically were cut off from the river. And so many of these individuals and populations don't understand that they are a river culture or a river people. In New Orleans, of all places, where you would expect that the people would think that they're river people, they don't really see the river either. And up until just recently, when there have been strides to have river parks in Baton Rouge, in New Orleans, in Memphis, these southern reaches of the river felt very disconnected with the river unless there was some flood event that was, ongoing. So they don't appreciate what comes from the river. I don't think the people who work in industries that use the river understand its relationship. And I think what we're trying to do in the South with our program that was more detailed in the Mississippi Delta was to start connecting these populations to the interests of the river.
Okay, very good. Well, that ends our questions here. I guess, Val, you've talked about a lot of things today. Would you like to leave our listeners with some final thoughts today?
My thoughts are let's get involved with this river before it's too late. We don't always think in one state legislature that we can attack such a large problem. But I think the state legislatures is the place to begin, and NCSL is a good place to begin a coalition of these interests based on our findings in these states. And then they have a group of legislators who can come to Minneapolis and begin laying some groundwork for us to work cooperatively with NCSL or NCSL to discreetly go off and begin thinking about these various river interests and how cooperative programs can emerge among our states. We might not agree on a lot at first, but to just begin, I think, the process and move away from the small and sort of comprehensive discussions that we've had, move away from that into a larger system discussion. It can be integral to the states, but it can also be a service that NCSL provides, I think, to the entire river region of 31 states that use the river as its source of life and dependence.
Okay. Thank you very much, Val. Appreciate your expertise, and good luck with this project. We want to thank everyone for joining us online today. As a reminder, you can keep track of all NCSL webinars by going to www.ncsl.org/NCSLU. Our next webinar in the NCSL University series will be next Wednesday, when we'll hold a session on the national election preview. Tim Story of National Conference of State Legislatures will be giving us an overview of what to expect for state legislative elections coming up in November. Again, our special thanks today to Val Marmillion and the America's Wetland Foundation. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion and look forward to being with you at our next webinar or NCSL meeting. On behalf of NCSL, this is Gene Rose. Thank you.